It all started with a simple letter from the Homeowners Association, a 50% increase in my fees, with no explanation. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. But then the glances, the whispers, the scratches on my Carthay made one thing clear. This wasn't about fees. This was about me. What they didn't know, though, was that I had the tools and the connections to fight back. And when I did, the fallout was far worse than they could have imagined. Edward, a 35-year-old lawyer with a calm demeanor, was excited about moving into his new neighborhood. It wasn't just any move, it was his chance to escape the noise of his past. The neighborhood itself looked like a postcard. Freshly trimmed lawns, kids on bicycles, and neighbors waving to each other. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to belong, at least on the surface. From the very first day, Edward noticed the stares. They weren't overtly hostile, but they carried a weight he knew all too well. It wasn't the first time people had looked at him like that, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and quiet judgment. He shrugged it off. I am here to live, not to be anyone's entertainment, he thought. Edward wasn't flashy. Sure, his Lexus stood out in the sea of minivans, but he wasn't the kind of guy to flaunt his success. As a corporate lawyer, he had built a solid career through grit and sharp wit. But none of that mattered here. In this neighborhood, he was just another new face. And apparently, one that people weren't quite sure belonged. Edward had been settling in for a few months when it happened. He opened his mailbox one morning to find a neatly folded letter from the HOA, Homeowners Association. It looked harmless, just another memo about community standards. Maybe a reminder to trim his hedges. But when he unfolded it, his stomach sank. Effective immediately, your HOA fees will increase by 50%. This adjustment reflects the additional maintenance required for your property. 50%, Edward muttered, reading it again to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. It didn't take a law degree to know this was highly unusual. He glanced across the street at his neighbor, Mr. Wilkins, who was watering his garden. Edward called out, "Hey, Mr. Wilkins, did your HOA fees go up too?" Wilkins looked up, hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Nope. Same as always." "Why?" Edward clenched the letter in his hand. "No reason," he said, forcing a polite smile, but inside something was brewing. Edward decided to attend the next HOA meeting to get answers. The meeting was held in a small, sterile community center. When he walked in, all eyes turned to him. The room went silent for a moment before the HOA president, a man named Mr. Hankins, greeted him with a tight smile. "Edward, glad you could join us. Please, take a seat." The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. As the meeting droned on about landscaping budgets and pool maintenance, Edward waited for the right moment. Finally, during the Q&A session, he raised his hand. "Yes, Edward?" Hankins asked, his tone polite but dismissive. "I'd like to know why my HOA fees were increased by 50%, Edward said, holding up the letter. His voice was calm but firm. The room grew quiet. Hankins' smile faltered for a split second before he responded. "Well, you see, Edward, there are additional expenses related to your property. These adjustments are standard practice." Edward locked eyes with him. "Standard practice for just one house? None of my neighbors received this notice." Hankins shrugged. "Some properties require more maintenance than others. I am sure you understand." Edward understood all right. This wasn't about maintenance. It was about something else he wasn't going to let slide. Edward left the HOA meeting more determined than ever. It was clear to him, this wasn't about property maintenance or expenses. It was about him, about who he was, and the way he looked. That tight smile from Hankins, the awkward silence from the other residents, it all reeked of something Edward had spent a lifetime dealing with but never accepted. Over the next week, things started to shift in the neighborhood. Edward's mailbox began receiving not just the usual utility bills, but also petty complaints. "Your trash cans were left out too long," or "Your car is parked slightly over the line." Then came the warnings. Failure to comply may result in additional fines. The letters were anonymous but bore the HOA seal. One morning, Edward noticed something else. His car, parked neatly in his assigned spot, had a fresh scratch running down the side. A coincidence? Hardly. "All right, Hankins," he muttered to himself. You want to play games? Let's play. Edward started digging. He reviewed every letter, every memo, and every financial report the HOA had sent him since he moved in. He cross-referenced it with his neighbors' experiences. The discrepancies were glaring. Somehow, Edward's property was racking up expenses no one else had. Lawn care fees for grass he maintained himself. Pool maintenance for a pool he didn't have. Security costs, yet the only security Edward had seen were the neighbors' suspicious glances. But digging deeper into the HOA's operations wasn't easy. Edward approached a few residents, hoping to find allies, but most avoided his questions. Only one older woman, Mrs. Clayton, a longtime resident, was willing to talk. "Listen, honey," she said, lowering her voice. "This isn't the first time Hankins has done something shady. A few years back, he raised fees on a single mom because he didn't like her kids riding their bikes on his lawn. He bullied her until she moved out. The man's a snake." Edward thanked her and left, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let Hankins push him out, but things were about to escalate even further. One evening, after a long day at work, Edward returned home to find a notice taped to his door. Bold letters declared, "Final warning, compliance mandatory." His blood boiled. He tore the paper down, but as he turned to go inside, he noticed someone watching. Across the street, Hankins was standing on his porch, arms crossed, with a smug expression plastered on his face. Edward stared back, unblinking, until Hankins retreated inside. "All right," Edward thought, his fists clenching. "You wanted my attention. Now you've got it." Edward decided it was time to use his skills. He wasn't just any lawyer, he specialized in uncovering fraud. If Hankins thought he could bully Edward without consequence, he was in for a rude awakening. Over the next few nights, Edward pored over the HOA's public records, tracing every dollar, every contract, every suspicious expense. What he found was worse than he imagined. Hankins had been funneling HOA funds into fake accounts, disguised as payments for neighborhood improvements. In reality, the money was being used for personal luxuries, a new car, expensive dinners, and even a private golf club membership. Edward smiled to himself. He finally had leverage. Edward waited for the next HOA meeting like a predator stalking prey. His evidence was airtight: detailed financial records, falsified invoices, and enough discrepancies to make Hankins sweat bullets. But Edward wasn't just going to present ETH, was going to dismantle Hankins in front of the very people he had been manipulating. The meeting room was packed, the usual chatter replaced by an odd tension. Edward sat near the back, his face calm but his mind racing. As Hankins began his typical spiel about community values and necessary adjustments, Edward stood abruptly. "Mr. Hankins," Edward interrupted, his voice steady but commanding. "I have some questions regarding the HOA's finances, specifically about these charges." He held up a stack of neatly bound papers. Hankins froze for a fraction of a second before regaining his composure. "Edward, this isn't the time for personal grievances," he said, his tone condescending. "If you have concerns, you can file a formal complaint." "Oh, I've done more than that," Edward replied, his lips curling into a slight smile. "I've spent the last few weeks going through every financial document this HOA has ever filed. Do you know what I found? Fraud, embezzlement, and your name on every single shady transaction." The room erupted in whispers. Hankins tried to dismiss Edward's accusations, but his usual smirk was gone. "This is ridiculous. You can't just make baseless claims without proof," he spat. Edward took a step forward, holding up the documents. "Proof? I've got copies of bank statements showing funds from the HOA account going straight to your private expenses. Fancy dinners, new cars, even a membership to the River Oaks Golf Club. Sound familiar?" Gasps filled the room. Hankins stammered, "Those are fabricated. Lies." Edward leaned in, locking eyes with Hankins. "Lies? Then explain why the HOA paid $12,000 for community landscaping. But the contractor listed doesn't even exist." The crowd turned against Hankins instantly, bombarding him with questions and accusations. Edward let the chaos unfold for a moment before delivering the final blow. "And one more thing," Edward said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You might think I am just another resident you can push around. But here is the thing, Hankins. I am the son of District Supervisor Charles Wallace, the man who oversees every HOA in this county. You picked the wrong person to mess with." The room fell silent. Hankins' face drained of color as the weight of Edward's words sank in. Everyone knew Charles Wallace. He wasn't just a powerful figure. He was a man known for his zero-tolerance policy on corruption. Hankins tried to bluster his way out, but it was too late. Edward's calm, meticulous takedown had left him with no ground to stand on. The days following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind of consequences. Hankins's corruption was not only exposed, but broadcast far and wide after Edward shared the evidence with local news outlets. Within a week, Hankins resigned in disgrace, his name permanently tarnished in the community. Legal authorities opened an investigation, and it was clear he wouldn't escape accountability. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Residents who had previously avoided Edward now approached him with apologies and gratitude. "We had no idea what he was doing, Mrs. Clayton said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for standing up when none of us could." Edward appreciated their words, but he wasn't here for recognition. For him, this was about principles. He had watched people like Hankins abuse their power his whole life, and this time, he had the tool sand the resolvedo stop it. As for the HOA, it underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was appointed under Edward's supervision, and he ensured transparent policies were put in place. The unfair fees were not only reversed but reduced for everyone. The neighborhood, once cold and judgmental, began to warm. Edward's calm yet firm nature earned him respect, even from those who had once doubted him. One evening, as Edward was enjoying a quiet moment on his porch, Mrs. Clayton stopped by with a plate of cookies. "You know," she said, her voice kind, "your father must be so proud of you." Edward smiled, looking out at the neighborhood he had helped restore. "He always told me to stand my ground," he replied. "Guess I finally learned how to do it." This resolution left the community better than it was before, a reminder that justice can prevail when the right person takes a stand. Edward had not only defended himself, but also changed the lives of those around him, proving that even one determined individual could make a difference. Thank you to everyone who took the time to listen to this story. I hope it was both captivating and inspiring for you. Let us know in the comments what topics you'd like to hear about next. Your feedback means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Mosaic for more powerful and emotional stories. See you soon.